Welcome into another episode of Preacher in the Hat. My name's Eric. Derek across from me, Steve to my right, who is back in the chair on the set, by the way.
Yeah, baby.
Welcome back.
Yeah, baby.
Yes, yes. Smaller claps than we give for a guest. But,
Yeah, that's right. That's
we're,
right.
we're glad.
Claps nonetheless.
Yeah, we're glad to have you back. Dave.
Glad to be back. Glad to be back.
So we enjoyed sitting down with our sisters.
I can't wait for that.
I hope. Yeah. As we record it today, it has not aired, which means that Dad has also not heard it because he was not sitting in. That one is still in the editing room, and I think may end up being 2 episodes. Of course, by the time you hear this, you'll know all that already. And if you hadn't watched or listened to those episodes, please do go back and catch those. We had Derek and I had a lot of fun doing that with our sisters, so it was a blast. But we've got something special on tap today for you. So this is probably one of the first requests that we've taken. It's definitely the first external request that we have taken. So we took a request to sit down with our sisters, Shauna and Tanya, but that was from you, Dad. So that was an episode. That was a series requested by you. This comes externally. And also somewhat internally because the person who made the request has been on the show.
That's right.
So, Greg, if you're listening, Greg Leday left this comment on our Where's God When I'm Scared episode. If you haven't heard that one, go back and catch that one. We enjoyed that one too. But he said, I love hearing you guys talk and laugh together. Oh, thanks, Greg. The relationship you three have is inspirational. If you can, do a podcast on how to develop the kind of relationship you three have. It would be valuable. Well, since our relationship between the three of us is absolutely perfect, we thought that this would be a good podcast to dive into.
He said inspirational. He didn't say perfect, did he? I hope.
Our relationship is not perfect. Never has been. Derek, right off the bat.
Yeah.
What's one thing that makes a relationship like this work?
This is going to sound probably kind of cheesy, I guess, or even cliche, but practice, I guess would be like just the main word I would say, is that you get all of these opportunities to, when the more you're around people, and the longer you're around people, you learn them, you spend time with them, and you get to understand kind of who they are as a person. And it helps develop your other relationships when you practice on the relationships that are inherent in your life, like family. Like I feel like you'd be hard pressed to find people who had terrible relationships with their siblings and parents growing up. Probably struggle relationally with other people outside of their family as well as they've grown into adults. And so, for me, Ben Rector has a song called "Old Friends," and the line in that song says, the closing line of the hook of that song says, "You can't make old friends, and you can't make old friends because they're the ones that have just been there from the beginning." So, I think practice is a big one. I'm not saying like you can't get to this point with someone you weren't born with.
You absolutely can.
Eric, you and I, our friend Jonathan is somebody we've known for a long time, but we haven't been friends since birth.
Right.
But it feels like we have. So it's, you can get to that point, but it just takes a lot of time.
I guess with him, it's been like since you're 12, right? Something like that, 11 or 12.
So we knew him when we were
all through middle school. We knew him,
but we weren't really like friends until 14.
Okay.
Ninth grade.
We weren't like full on friends, like,
hanging out.
Well, didn't y'all play baseball on one summer with him when you were 12?
Sixth grade, just spring rec ball.
Gotcha.
We were on his team.
Okay.
So that's where we really met, because sixth grade was our first year at Homewood.
Okay.
And we were that spring. We were on. His dad was the head coach, and we were on his baseball team.
Yeah, I remember.
That's where we really met, and so we were like cordial and like good acquaintances through middle school, I feel like. And then in 9th grade, I had 5 of my 7 classes with him, and that's kind of where things.
And then we also all made the
baseball team, and that's where
yeah,
it all happened.
Got you.
So we had a lot of practice with him as well.
Yeah.
All right, Dad, you're up next.
I love practice. I hadn't thought about practice. I first think about humor. I just think that it's very difficult to have a healthy relationship. And when I say humor, I'm not talking about corny jokes. I'm not talking about that kind of thing. But I think it kind of boils down to this idea of I can see the humor in a good way. Another way to describe it, but better maybe and a little more in depth, would be like joy, the sense of joy of being around with each other, And I think when you develop friendship a whole lot better when you begin with joy. When you begin with that joy being, as somebody described it recently, is that idea of glad to be together. For whatever reason, glad to be together. A lot of friendships kind of come out of events where I'm together with somebody and I enjoy the time together. For example, like a father and a son. I mean, I enjoyed you guys from the very beginning. You know what I'm saying? I enjoy just being around you, obviously. We have old school VHSs where we were on the floor, and y'all were crawling on top of me, and, we were rolling around, we were doing this, we were doing that, and then wrestling on the way, I remember y'all get Jonah, who was a little buddy, and y'all would come, all 3 of y'all would try to tackle me at the same time over in Homewood. I don't know if y'all remember that in Parkside. That happened often. I say often, seemed often to me. But anyhow, even that kind of wrestling thing, that kind of thing for dads and sons, sometimes I watch it with, especially Brian. Brian is really good at that with his boys. If you notice, they love being at each other. Brother-in-law. I'm sorry, yeah. And with our grandson Justin and grandson Gavin, he's just really good of wrestling with them and playing with them and that kind of thing. So they enjoy being together. And so for me, if I begin with joy, it's not hard to develop that relationship deeply over a period. With a little bit of practice, you're on your way.
Cool. Okay, so I'm going to throw one out there that I'm probably going to have to explain a little bit.
So that's cool.
One way to approach, or not just approach relationships, but one key component of relationships, and especially a relationship like the 3 of ours where we've crossed, it sounds weird when we're father and sons to say where we've crossed paths, but we've crossed paths in a lot of different places.
Oh, yeah.
With a lot of different, I'm going to say it, hats on, I know.
There you go. Go ahead. Keep it coming.
I tried to keep it out.
Hats on. Let's go.
With in a lot of different places with a lot of different hats on.
That's right.
And so not our only interaction is not father and sons. Like we've had so many others. Okay. Yeah. So the word that I'm going to say that's key in this situation is language. So I was been able to read a part of a book by a guy. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah, let's clap for
Dad
that.
Should be so proud.
Golf clap.
I read, Dad. I read. Yeah.
Jesus is still at work.
Yeah, I got a long way to go to catch up to his library.
Can they see the bookshelf?
Yeah.
I recommend.
And I didn't even buy the book. I rented it from the library.
Oh, whatever.
And I believe it's by the guy's name, and I'm sorry if I mess up.
Butcher this.
Yeah, I've never heard his name. It's I think it's David Marquet. It's Marquet. So I think his name is David Marquet, and he's a former military. He originally authored I think the first book he authored was called "Turn the Ship Around," where he was the captain, or please don't like military
You're gonna
people, please
bust
don't
rank
jump
on
all
him.
over me. Maybe the person who runs a submarine is not a captain. I'm so sorry. But he was the top person.
He was the boss.
Yeah, he was the boss on a submarine, and he took over, and it was like, from a leadership perspective, it was just in shambles. And everything in the military is so command oriented and all that kind of stuff, and people were miserable, blah, blah, blah. He came in, absolutely just like turned it completely, spun everything on its head, and he was asking opinions and and getting and asking people, well, what would you do, as opposed to just barking commands, all this kind of stuff. I did not read that book. It's called Turn the Ship Around, but that was kind of where he got his start. But it seems like a really cool one. I was reading a book called Leadership is Language. This was the second book of his that he wrote. And this was about a ship that he was not on. It was a container ship that was going into, true story, that was going down the East Coast, I think, into the Gulf of Mexico, like going to go in that way. Hurricane coming, all that kind of stuff. They had a way where they could cut into the Gulf early, but I think for one reason or another, it would cost them time, but it was a safer route based on where the hurricane was. The captain of the ship was like just straight ahead, like they were gonna do what they always do no matter what. He didn't care about the hurricane. Well, they lost the ship and everybody. So, but they have like the black box or whatever they call it, from the ship. And so they hear all of this stuff. He went back and analyzed all of like the conversation with, the captain and all of the people on deck. And there was like all this kind of stuff that he was, that the captain's doing, where like, asking, overriding people, like people would bring a concern about approaching the storm, and he would just
don't want to hear it.
Not going to hear it, no way, just kind of like make light of the fact that why would we be scared, whatever. People called him from the whatever, wherever they're I'm so sorry, everybody. Where people who are like who've been on, who've worked on a ship, are like, please shut up. People are calling him while he's sleeping in the middle of the night, being like, we really need to do something about this, and no, and so he started. So he tells that story at the start of the book, and about how a lot of what the guy was saying was more like coercion as opposed to collaboration and that sort of thing. So like a leading, like you would present something as the captain and be like, and you think that's a good plan, right? It's like, what can you, under someone's authority, like, and someone leads you in that way, leads in the conversation in that direction. How easy is it for you to tell me no? I'm like, so that's a good plan, right? Like, I say it confidently. I tell you what I think we need to do, and the only thing I really offer up to you is an opportunity to agree with me, verbally. You don't really have any chance to. And so that's, or
if you disagree, get lost.
Right. And so that's what the book is about. Is like how you lead. Leadership is a lot about not just what you say, also things you don't say, and listening, all that kind of stuff. So language was the word that I chose because I felt like there has been like this, once again, we're father and sons, but we've been in other scenarios, especially in church. Derek and I were Dad's executive pastors for the final, 2 years that you were senior pastor,
at least 2 or 3.
And so there was like this triangulation almost of leadership. So like Derek was the worship pastor, and we were both, kind of sharing the executive pastor role. Dad was the senior pastor, all this kind of stuff, where the language was between the three of us has always been more collaborative than coercion. And so even when Derek and I stepped into that, a role that we really knew nothing about, to be quite honest, we were still given the opportunity to do what we thought was best.
Case in point, y'all took over the ministry leadership team meetings that we would have that I was on to, even as senior pastor. And I remember you saying to me, okay, Dad, you've got 7 minutes to do this. You've got 7 minutes to do that. And I actually liked that because you were helping me not get up there and just dominate and talk about that. In other words, I was supposed to speak. And so I like that because that would be collaboration. Because as a senior pastor, I could have said, I'll talk as long as I want to.
Right.
But I didn't. And so for me, I actually enjoyed that. But that's opposite from command and control.
Right.
You know, that kind of
thing. It's working together. And I think to build something like this, you have to be able to approach things like that.
Yeah, right.
Because we're not currently, none of us are currently in any of those roles, besides Derek still being worship leader, and I'm one of his co-leaders. That after that kind of stuff, that we still have, that we have a great relationship beyond that, means that we handled all, that kind of new roles, whatever it was, like kind of like it was a new world for all of us, honestly. We handled that well in how we dealt with each other, and even how we handled conflict, because you're like, oh, well, you guys are, father and sons, it works out well. It's like you just, that's so easy for you because you don't have conflict. And it's like, well, we had plenty of conflict. But we just knew how to, it didn't mean we didn't even have there wasn't tension at following conflict, for a little while, whatever. But we knew how to walk through that and come out of that, and we knew how and where to draw boundaries and that kind of thing. So take a second on that and talk, because someone will say, well, when I say, well, we knew how to draw boundaries, that sort of thing, someone will say, okay, well, how do you do that? Okay. How do you do that?
Well, the language, I really like that language word, because I've been recently exposed to a book called Trust and Inspire about leadership. And it talks about how in business and so forth in our culture today, we're moving from what they call a command and control kind of thing to a trust and inspire sort of approach with employees, as leaders, and how you go in. They talk about several CEOs. Stephen M.R. Covey wrote this book, and his dad was very famous for some other stuff, but Covey has written on this, and he's written really good books on trust and inspire. What he says is what you're describing. He said a lot of leaders do not learn how to move from command and control to trust and inspire because they're afraid they'll lose control if they do so. If they go to trust and inspire, they're afraid that, well, then they won't do what I want them to do. So what you have there, Eric, in my opinion, when you ask about boundaries, is in command and control, the boundaries are very, very clear. I'm in charge, you're not. You have to respond to me, you have to agree with me, you have to do that. In trust and inspire you have boundaries, but they're different. They're different in that you take a look at believing that somebody actually may have the ability. And so especially, one reason it was not difficult for me was because I knew both of you were better at administration than I was, okay? And so for you to be executive pastors was actually a blessing for me because you were tapping into bringing your strengths. Both of you had strengths in an area where I had not as much strength and sometimes weakness. You know what I'm saying? And so when you can do trust and inspire, then you bring that into, instead of command and control, I've got to be the administrator, I've got to be the this, I've got to be the that, I've got to do all those things. And so the language for me is to move to trust and inspire. Trust and inspire said, I believe in you, I believe in your ability, and I believe you're going to do it. And he also had written another book on the speed of trust that talks about, do I trust your character or trust your competence? And he said, when you distinguish between those, when you trust each other. And so what I was going to say about relationship, another word to pull bring in here is trust. If you start with trust, if you start with joy, if you continue with practice, if you understand language and so forth, then your relationship will thrive and grow because you do trust each other, not so you can trust each other. I think a lot of times in relationships, it's almost like people spend their whole life when they don't trust much. They spend almost their whole life trying to see if they can trust somebody, and they never can. And so they never will. And so they draw all kinds of boundaries that are really, really very, very stifling and do not enhance the relationship. Now, I trust our grandchildren. I trust your son and your son. I trust them to do certain things, and I trust their character. I don't trust their competence to drive my car.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And so you have to look the difference between trusting their characters, not because they're bad guys that they can't drive my car. It's that they're 4 years old that they can't drive. So their competence level is not there. So I don't know if that, for me, I think some people draw boundaries in character, like, well, I don't know if you can be trusted to do that. And when you hear that, it really gets kind of crazy, because what you hear is I don't trust your character. Where I may trust your character, I may not trust your competence. And as long as I make that clear, that there's that distinguish, then the relationship can thrive. So I may not trust your judgment on a particular issue, but that doesn't mean I don't trust you as a human being to have a relationship with me. And I think that's foundational, trust of each other's character, trusting each other on a core level.
I would say, try to figure out the exact way to phrase this. If you have a common directive, I feel like that you're working towards, that's already established.
Okay.
So in our house, and we talked about this, what our grandfather said at his wife's funeral, whatever. Ours was, mostly summed up in our house as for me and my
house, we will serve the Lord. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that was a common directive in our relationship.
Yeah.
Right.
That's cool.
Such that when it came back around, the quote unquote boundary of that was that we will serve the Lord. Like
Yeah,
whatever
that's good. I
happens,
like
we'll
that.
serve the Lord.
That's
So when ministry stuff comes around and things, and we're disagreeing and I'm, angry with my dad or something, or, and I'm sorry, angry with the senior pastor and all that stuff, whatever,
Right.
the directive
Right.
was, we will serve the Lord. And so I'm, that person that I'm in conflict with at that time, I know that he feels his directive is to serve the Lord.
I like that.
My directive was to serve the Lord. And so you have someone who has already set that boundary in the relationship. You being the father there, it becomes naturally you are the one who set that.
Yeah, right.
But that to me is a great way to look at it at the story of that container ship, right? His directive was to do things that the way we've always done them.
Right.
But imagine if he had changed his directive to say, our directive is to get where we need to go as safely as possible.
Yeah.
And then so it's established as command and control. If the directive is pure, right? If the directive is pure to say, like, I care about everybody on the ship and what we're going to do over these next 3 or 4 days or however long it takes, whatever, to say, it's like, we're going to get to our destination as safely as possible, even if that means adding on a little bit of extra time to our trip. And then you set a great environment for trust and inspire, because everybody in their mind is like, okay, what can I do to help us get here as safely as possible? But if you don't have that in the business world, and I've been in some instances like this where there wasn't a great directive already established and you immediately go to trust and inspire, everybody has a great idea about what needs to get done, but it may not be cohesive.
Right.
So that is one thing you can kind of forget, is like, let's all work together. Okay. But somebody has to decide what we're working toward.
Right.
I like that.
And it's funny. Also read another book. Yeah.
Whoa.
Get it up.
I'm done clapping.
Oh, okay. I was the only one clapping for
Mr.
myself.
Producer, are you recording this? Okay.
It's actually a book that was written when I was like 6 years old, I think. But it was a business model kind of book by John Cotter called Leading Change, and it's for organizations kind of moving more towards that model. Now, Trust and Inspire was not the exact way that they lay it out, but it was kind of moving more towards that. And the first step that he outlines for moving to a trust, we're calling it a Trust and Inspire kind of workplace, is creating a sense of urgency. And so that actually popped into my head, Derek, when you were talking about our common directive, which has always been, we will serve the Lord. And, Dad, you and Mom put that, like, there was a sense of urgency around like that. Like, right. There wasn't it's like there wasn't a...
It was not optional.
It was not like... yes, not optional, but it also was not, like, lackadaisical. It wasn't just, like, we get the kids to church on Sundays. It's like it wasn't just, it didn't lack effort. Like, there was also a lot behind it, and there was a sense of urgency behind it. And for some reason, this seems like such a trivial example, but I remember one time when we were loading up, and this was back when all 4 of your kids were still at home, and we were loading up for church on a Sunday morning. We lived up in Center Point, so we all rode in together. All 6 of us rode in together at that time because we were pretty far away from the building. And I remember we were a little bit late getting going, and this always stuck with me about church, about getting to church and being, we were late. People were still coming out the door. You were already sitting in the car. And I remember you said something to the effect of, we got no problem hustling to school on Monday mornings. He's like, what? But you're like, why can't we hustle to church on Sunday mornings? And that wasn't exactly how you said it, but like, that was the idea behind it. And that always stuck with me. It was like, okay, this is just as important, so not just church. And, you were talking about explicitly going to church on Sunday mornings, but the urgency wasn't just about that, in our daily lives. It was like, it was everything all around. And so,
that's, I mean, the idea of common directive and another way we worded that before, using language at Grace and Truth, and we talked about this quite a bit among us as leaders now, I'm not talking about just as father, son, was heart and strategy.
Right.
So the common directive is the heart. It's the heart, it's the soul of it, and that doesn't change, in my opinion. The strategy about how we flesh that out can change sometimes. But so the common directive gives us the freedom. When you talk about boundaries, it gives us the freedom to move beyond. For example, when Shauna turned 18, I wrote her a letter, your oldest sister, and I said, Shauna, the day that you came to faith in Christ, your daddy became your brother. What is that? The heart of what we were was not just that I was her father and she was a daughter. It was that we also shared that common connection with Jesus.
Right. And I think when you like transpose that into our relationship, is that the heart has always been the same. We've had to take a lot of different strategies for different scenarios that we've been in.
That's right.
So I think and that's a great parallel. That's a great parallel to draw. Derek, did you have another?
I would say this kind of pivots from how we've been talking about the stuff, whatever. But I would definitely say drawing on the ability or having the ability to be okay with some disagreement is important. Which was kind of what I was pointing to earlier a little bit. But it's I think that's important in any relationship, is to be able to say, like, we're not necessarily maybe what we do or what we're doing right now, we're having a little trouble disagreeing on. But again, I think it kind of goes back to that common directive that you have.
So here's where humor connects with what you're talking about. So Grandpa, your grandfather, who knew that I liked a particular plaque that had this saying on it about disagreement. And so he bought it for me. And this has been like 10, 15 years ago, maybe. No, yeah, because I was at Shepherd's Fold as a director. And it said this. It says, I'd agree with you, but then we both be wrong.
That sounds like a gift he would give.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I keep it, I don't put it out front because some people would not understand it. But that was his way of saying, and I like that because, see, that has helped me a lot. Somebody gave me a plaque recently, said, I may be wrong, but I doubt it. When you can laugh at yourself like that, when you can bring humor about the disagreement, is to say you still think you're right, probably in disagreement. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But to know you're okay and you can still laugh at it to say, okay, I'm really holding the line on this one, I think is what makes it possible to do what you're talking about, Derek, and that is to look at disagreement and not get all bent out of shape about it.
Right.
That's
okay.
short. That's a short one. I
Yeah.
don't know, you got to spend a whole bunch of time there.
No.
But it's
like
just
it.
it's one that
Give me one more, Dad.
I thinking about this today in two different ways, but I'm going to just go with one of them. I'm going to use the word honest. And by honest, I mean this. I'm honest about where I'm at in my relationship with God. I'm honest about where I am in relationship to myself. And I'm honest about where I am in my relationship with other people. Ken Sande talks about it when he says God-aware, self-aware, and other-aware. So when I say honesty, it's learning to come. I never am perfectly God-aware or God-engaged. I'm not ever perfectly self-aware or self-engaged. I'm never perfectly other-aware but other-engaged. And I think sometimes some people are God-aware and God-engaged, but they're not self-aware and self-engaged, or they're not other-aware and other-engaged. We try to teach our children to be other-aware and other-engaged because children don't naturally do that, you know? And so the idea then for me is that I need to be honest with where I'm at, and honest with the feelings I have. How am I being impacted by this, and how am I responding in this situation? And then also, how are other people seeing me? One leader I know in Good News Fellowship says this. He says, I always like to think about put myself in place of how are you seeing me when I sit across the table from you? That's being other aware about how I am impacting other people. And when you learn that you are also impacting other people and you spend time on that, I think it's helpful. So I would say honest in terms of God-aware, self-aware, other-aware.
Yeah. I think that's a really good one.
And there needs to be a balance between those three. Because I, as a senior pastor, could say, well, God told me, and all I care about what God says. I don't care what you think. It doesn't really matter what I'm feeling, praise God.
The issue with that is most people think they heard.
I know. And if you're not self-aware, you're dangerous to hear from God, because sometimes God, what you think is God, comes through your filter, comes through your glasses. And if you're not other aware, and if you're not doing it, you will be in trouble. And so as a leader, you always have to be, you don't just do everything everybody else wants you to. That's not leadership. You don't always do everything like you feel like it. That's not leadership either. But at the same time, you do what God says, but you need to be sure that you're not mixing that up, and you need to be alert and be strong in all three of those areas, not just one of those areas. Because the Scripture's full of it. When it says what? Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The second commandment is like unto it. Love your neighbors yourself. And then it says this, all the law and the prophets hang on those two commandments. On those two things, being God-aware and other-aware will help you be self-aware, and then you will be able to have relationships and grow.
The preacher's preaching.
I am. Pass the offering plate here, somebody, real quick. All right.
The last one that I wanted to touch on is, and I struggle with the way to describe this because I'm not a big fan of a particular phrase, but it doesn't make any difference. But one thing that you have to be, I feel like that you have to be able to do in a relationship like this is to be able. It can't be one. It can't be one person who's giving. Like you have to go.
Yeah.
You have to go in all directions. And now. I'm going to say the phrase. I don't even know why I don't like it, but I can't stand it when people say pouring into to each other. But it's fine. But like
I think the producer doesn't like that.
it's fine.
Either.
It's
It
just
sounds
for
right.
one reason or another. I really don't know. It's just not my favorite phrase. But like
agree.
you will have done that for us 50 times over because you're our dad and you had like a 21-year head start on all that kind of stuff. I don't know whatever. Not that we didn't do that ever, growing up, but the ratio is massively imbalanced. But as we grew up and and now all being adults, it has to be like more. It has to get more equal.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And on that footing. And so it's one of those things where like in relationships where I have been frustrated in the past, like when somebody, and this is good or better than anyone because you've done counseling and you've been a senior pastor, for, so many years, for decades, in that I get frustrated when I hear like someone feels like that they're not getting enough from me anymore when it's always been a one-way giving, and like, it's like, I don't have like, it's not that that you expect return, but it's just that like you can get to a point where you're so exhausted that like it's almost like God is saying it's like your time in giving here on in this relationship is it's moved on to someone else now, to fill that. And like you can't keep up that's not how a friendship, that's not how like a triangle relationship or whatever works. Like can't be there can't be any one-way streets. Like if it is a triangle, like all three sides have to be two-way streets, and then there's like some kind of roundabout in the middle. I don't know, but it just can't be. There can be no one-way streets whatsoever.
Eric and I, we've had that where at one point someone said something to the effect of like, how come you guys no longer like ask me to, how come y'all don't ask me to do anything anymore, or something like that. And you're like, well, two reasons. One, you never did when we asked, or when we tried to make plans, you never did. And then two, you never tried to initiate. Right. So it was all about us, chasing after you constantly declining to the point where you're like, well, maybe this person just doesn't want to do
and
that.
It doesn't mean that we're not saying at all that you're never supposed to pursue someone who, but as far as building this type of relationship, it's a critical piece.
And so if you have somebody who like is constantly, kind of like not kind of declining or whatever, I can't make it, or you start to think like, oh well, maybe that's just they don't want that, and so you just kind of back off. And now if they reached out and said do something, you would be like, okay, yeah, sure, let's do that. But it's if it's not a priority, and then so that's where it is like you have to also reciprocate, because you can't turn back around to that person. If I'm that person who was always turning someone else down for all this stuff, whatever, and be like, hey, what happened? You don't invite me to stuff anymore. Well, why would I have expected that if I
Sometimes I talk about it when people have been in dependent relationships. They think they have to move to independence, but I tell them, I teach this in classes all over the place, Don't move to independence, move to interdependence. And in the kingdom of God, we have to be interdependent. There's not one person who's the giver and one person who's the taker or the receiver. We have to learn the spiritual gift of receiving. Jesus demonstrated that with a woman that came and unloaded that perfume on his feet. And everybody said, oh, I should have said you. And he said, no, stop. He had the spiritual discipline of receiving as well as giving. Because what happens, if I think I am the giver, I'm always the teacher and never the student. I am always the giver and never the receiver. When I develop that kind of relationship as a parent, and I watch so many parents who cannot make that shift when their children become adults. They still think that they are the parent and they are the all-knowing one, and they don't need to receive anything from their children. All they need, especially advice, especially wisdom, especially anything. It's been easy for me because I've wanted in our relationship, I like what we do here, for example, and Preacher in the Hat. One thing I love about it is you guys pretty much decide what direction we're going to go and that kind of thing. I love sitting in this seat. I could say as the father and the one who has more experience in ministry to say, oh, no. Now, I give input, sometimes I may say, oh, I don't know if we want to go that route. It's just my suggestion, but it says one of 3 or 4 in this case with the Mr. Producer here. I love that kind of thing because I think that your what you have to offer is very crucial for me. Not just what I have to offer is good for you.
Absolutely. And so I hope everybody was able to get an idea of what we kind of laid out for how this sort of thing has been built. Derek kind of alluded to it at the beginning, where it's not something that just snaps out of thin air, and happens. It's a process. It's trust based.
It's multifaceted.
Yes, absolutely. multi, and those facets are also multifaceted and all that stuff.
Right.
But we just wanted to say a big thank you to Greg Leday for asking us to talk about this, because Greg, you did a great job with this exact same relationship building with your dad. And if all of the audience who's hearing me now doesn't know what I'm talking about, make sure you go back and listen to our Streetlights Testimonials episode where Greg was on, and he was able to share some about that because you exemplified all the stuff we were talking about to a T. So thank y'all so much for joining us. This has been another episode of Preacher in the Hat. For Derek and Steve, Chris behind the cameras, I'm Eric. See you next time.